My name is Marisa Ellison, and I want to tell you about the night I found out my husband had signed my name to a loan I never saw, to fund a life I wasn't invited into. He came home late that Tuesday smelling like someone else's perfume and kissed my forehead like nothing was wrong. He asked what was for dinner. He complained about traffic. In a storage unit 40 minutes from our house, under my maiden name, sat the company my father built and I had quietly rebuilt from nothing, worth more than Grant would earn in the rest of his career combined. He thought I was the quiet one, the one who handled the schedule and never asked questions. He had no idea what he was about to need from me. Before we get into it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I want to start with something small because that's usually where it starts. Grant liked his coffee a certain way, dark roast, 2 sugars, no cream, and he liked it waiting for him by 6:15 whether he'd slept well or not. I never minded making it. There's a particular calm in a kitchen before anyone else is awake, the tile cold under your feet, the house not yet filled with anyone's opinions. I'd stand there most mornings with my own cup, watching the light change over the backyard, and for 20 minutes the day still belonged entirely to me. I didn't resent the routine. I want to be honest about that from the start. I built it the same way I built everything else in that marriage, quietly, without asking anyone's permission, because it was easier than explaining myself to a man who had stopped listening somewhere around year 6. Grant and I had been married 11 years by the time any of this started to surface. We met the ordinary way, through mutual friends, a barbecue in someone's backyard where he made a joke about the potato salad that actually made me laugh, which was rarer than he probably realized. He was ambitious back then in a way that felt exciting instead of exhausting, always talking about the next deal, the next promotion, the version of himself he was building toward. I liked being near that energy. I didn't yet understand that ambition, left unchecked long enough, has a way of turning inward, of deciding that the people closest to it exist mainly to support its next move. I didn't see that coming. Nobody sees that coming. You just wake up one day and realize you've become part of someone else's staging area. My father died the September before all of this, and it changed something in me that I don't think Grant ever noticed. He'd spent 41 years building a small precision parts manufacturer outside Dayton, the kind of business that never made headlines but kept 11 families employed and supplied components to companies that did make headlines. When he died, the business was struggling, undercapitalized, competing against overseas suppliers who could beat his prices but not his tolerances. My brother wanted no part of it. Grant, when I brought it up at dinner one night, barely looked up from his phone. "Sell it," he said. "Take whatever you can get and be done with it. It's not worth the hassle, Marisa. You don't know anything about running a manufacturing company." I remember exactly how that sentence landed, flat and certain, like he'd already closed the conversation before I'd finished opening it. I told him I was thinking about it. What I actually did was quieter than that. I drove out to Dayton the following weekend without telling him, sat in my father's office that still smelled faintly of machine oil and burnt coffee, and talked to the plant manager, a woman named Denise who'd worked there for 19 years and knew every account, every margin, every reason the business was bleeding money it didn't have to lose. She didn't need saving in the way Grant assumed. She needed someone willing to modernize the equipment, renegotiate 2 supplier contracts that had gone stale for a decade, and go after the medical device sector instead of competing on commodity parts. I had spent 9 years doing exactly that kind of restructuring work as a consultant, work Grant referred to at parties as my little side thing, the hobby that helped pay for vacations. I didn't correct him at those parties. I've thought about why a lot since then, and the honest answer is that correcting him had stopped feeling worth the energy years earlier. Every time I tried to explain what I actually did for clients, the margin work, the operations audits, the turnarounds, his eyes would do this specific thing, a kind of polite drift toward the nearest exit in the conversation, and I learned to stop offering information he'd already decided wasn't important. That's a particular kind of loneliness, being married to someone who has quietly decided you're not that interesting. It doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It just sits there, low, for years, until you stop expecting anyone to ask the second question. I got used to being asked the first question, and never the second. So when I decided to keep my father's company instead of liquidating it, I didn't make an announcement. I incorporated the new entity under my maiden name, Voss Precision, using a consulting fee I'd been quietly banking in an account Grant had never once looked at, because Grant did not look at accounts that weren't actively feeding his lifestyle. I brought in Denise as operating partner with a real equity stake, something my father had never offered her and absolutely should have. I told Grant I'd sold the business to an equipment leasing group for a modest sum, enough to sound plausible, small enough that he lost interest in the details within about 4 minutes. He never asked to see paperwork. He never asked for the buyer's name. He simply filed it away as one more small thing I'd handled so he didn't have to. For the first year, Voss Precision barely broke even. I drove out to Dayton most Fridays under the cover of a standing consulting client Grant believed was based there, which wasn't entirely a lie, since I did have a client nearby I visited on the same trips. I sat in on production meetings. I renegotiated our steel supplier contract myself after 3 months of relationship building that involved more terrible diner coffee than I care to remember. I hired a young engineer named Priya who'd been overlooked at a larger firm and gave her the medical device tolerance project nobody else wanted to touch. 6 months in, we landed our first orthopedic components contract. It was small, $40,000, but it was proof, and proof is the only currency that matters in the beginning. I didn't tell Grant. I didn't tell anyone except Denise and my sister. Somewhere in that second year, while I was rebuilding a company Grant had told me wasn't worth the hassle, he started rebuilding something of his own, though I didn't know it yet. Looking back now, I can see the exact season it changed, late spring, the way his phone habits shifted almost overnight, screen down on the counter, a passcode that appeared where there hadn't been one before. He started working later, claiming client dinners that ran past 10, and when I asked how work was going, he gave me the kind of answer that sounds complete but tells you nothing. Fine, busy, the usual. I noticed. I want to be clear about that. I noticed, and I filed it away the same careful way I filed away everything else that didn't fit the story I was still choosing to believe, because believing it was easier than confronting what I suspected. The paperwork found me, not the other way around, which is usually how these things go. I was searching for our property tax statement in the file cabinet in Grant's home office that November, a task he'd asked me to handle because he was, in his words, slammed at work. Behind the folder I needed sat a slim manila envelope from a bank I didn't recognize, and inside it, a home equity line of credit agreement for $60,000, opened 4 months earlier, secured against the house we owned jointly. My signature was on the second page. I stared at it for a long moment because I had never signed that document, had never even seen it before that afternoon, and yet there it was. My name and handwriting close enough to mine that a bank teller wouldn't blink twice, but not close enough to fool the woman whose actual signature it was supposed to be. I sat down at his desk and read the entire agreement twice. $60,000, drawn down in 3 transfers over 4 months, all to an account I didn't recognize. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because I would have expected them to shake. Instead, I felt something colder settle in. The specific stillness that comes when a suspicion you've been quietly managing for months finally gets handed hard evidence. I photographed every page with my phone. I put the envelope back exactly where I'd found it, angled precisely the way it had been, because I understood immediately that I was not ready to have this conversation yet, not until I knew the full shape of what I was looking at. I finished searching for the tax statement. I found it. I closed the drawer. That night, I made dinner like any other night, chicken and rice, the meal we'd had probably 300 times over 11 years. Grant talked about a client renewal that had almost fallen through. I listened, asked one question at the right moment, passed him the salad. I had spent 11 years learning exactly how to be present at that table without actually being present, and I used every bit of that skill that evening. I watched him eat, watched the easy way he leaned back in his chair afterward, satisfied, unaware, and I thought about the $60,000 and the signature that wasn't mine, and I said absolutely nothing. I cleared the plates. I said I had an early morning. I went upstairs and I called my sister Renata, who has never once in her life needed the full story before she started being useful. Renata had spent 6 years as a paralegal at a family law firm before switching careers, and she still remembered enough to be dangerous in the right direction. I told her about the signature, the $60,000, the unfamiliar account. She was quiet for a moment, and then she asked exactly the right question. Has anything else felt off? I told her about the phone, the late nights, the passcode. She didn't tell me what she thought it meant, not yet. She just said, "Find out everything you can before you say a word to him, and then call me back." I appreciated her for that more than I could say at the time. The way she resisted the urge to speculate and instead handed me a plan. I stayed up late that night making a list. Not of accusations, of documents I needed. Over the following 2 weeks, I became extremely good at a kind of quiet, methodical archaeology. I requested electronic statements be sent to my own email for accounts I technically had access to, but had never bothered monitoring, because trust, I was learning, is its own kind of blindness. I found a second credit card Grant had opened 8 months earlier, currently carrying a balance of $11,000, mostly hotel charges and restaurant charges, in a part of the city we never went to together. I cross-referenced every hotel date against his stated work travel, using the shared calendar I maintained because Grant, despite managing 8 figures in client accounts at his job, could not reliably remember his own meetings without me tracking them. Every date matched a business trip he'd told me about. Every single one landed on a Thursday or Friday when he claimed to be somewhere he apparently never was. I found her name by accident, the way you find most things that were never actually hidden that well, just hidden from someone who'd stopped looking. Grant's work laptop synced photos automatically to a shared family cloud account we'd set up years earlier for the kids' school pictures, an account he had clearly forgotten still existed. Buried in a folder from a work conference 8 months prior was a photo he hadn't meant to keep. 2 people at a rooftop bar, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I sat with that photo for a long time. I zoomed in on her badge, still visible on her lanyard in the corner of the image. Danielle Reyes, Regional Accounts. She worked at his company. She had for 3 years. I called Renata back that night and read her everything: the credit card, the hotel dates, the photo, the name. She was quiet in a way I'd learned meant she was thinking carefully rather than reacting. 2 years, she said finally. That's roughly what this looks like from the pattern, not months. Longer. She recommended an attorney, a woman named Patricia Alvarez who specialized in complex marital estates and had, according to Renata, absolutely no patience for husbands who thought charm was a legal strategy. I called the next morning and got an appointment for the following Tuesday. I hung up the phone and sat in my car in the office parking garage for a full 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside and act like a normal person having a normal day. That became a skill too, eventually, acting normal while carrying something enormous. I want to pause here and tell you what I did not do during those 2 weeks, because I think it matters. I did not confront him. I did not stop making his coffee at 6:15. I did not change my behavior in any way that would have signaled I knew something was wrong, and I understand how that might sound to some of you, but I want you to understand the reasoning. Patricia would later tell me, in almost those exact words, that the version of a divorce where one spouse tips their hand before understanding the full financial picture is the version where that spouse ends up losing far more than they should. I wasn't protecting Grant by staying quiet. I was protecting myself, protecting Voss Precision. protecting 11 employees in Dayton who had no idea their livelihood was about to become a footnote in someone else's betrayal. Patricia's office was smaller than I expected and more organized than any space I'd ever been in. Files color-coded, not a single loose paper anywhere. She listened to the entire story without interrupting once, taking notes in handwriting so neat it looked typed. When I finished, she set down her pen and said something I've thought about often since. She said, "The mistake most people make is thinking discovery is the hard part. Discovery is actually the easy part. The hard part is what you do with the 8 weeks after discovery, before anyone else knows you know." She told me to keep documenting everything, to say nothing, and to bring her a full accounting of Voss Precision separately, so she could establish, cleanly and early, that it had never been marital property to begin with. I told her it wasn't. She said, "Good, then let's prove it beyond any argument he can make." Over the following month, while Grant continued his double life with what I can only describe as remarkable confidence, I quietly did 2 things in parallel. I handed Patricia everything she needed: bank records, the fraudulent equity line, the credit card statements, time-stamped screenshots of the photo and its metadata. And I pushed Voss Precision harder than I ever had, because the medical device contract Priya had been developing for 8 months was finally moving toward a signature, a 3-year supply agreement with a regional orthopedic device manufacturer that would more than triple our annual revenue the moment it closed. I drove to Dayton 3 times that month instead of my usual once, sitting across from their procurement team, walking their engineers through our tolerance data personally, because I understood something Grant never did about me. I don't ask for what I want. I build until it's undeniable. The contract closed on a Thursday afternoon while I was sitting in a status meeting at my consulting job, half listening to a discussion about a client deliverable that suddenly felt very small. Denise called me the moment the ink was dry, her voice doing something I'd never heard from her before, cracking slightly around the edges of her professionalism. 3 years, guaranteed volume, exclusive supplier status on their new hip implant line. Voss Precision, a company Grant had told me wasn't worth the hassle 2 years earlier, was now valued, according to the term sheet our accountant put together that week, at just over $4 million, with a growth trajectory that made even that number feel conservative. I sat in my car afterward, the same way I had after calling the attorney, except this time what I felt wasn't dread. It was something closer to arrival. I didn't tell Grant, not that week, not the next. I want to explain why, because I know some of you are wondering. Patricia had been clear that the safest path was to let the marital estate freeze in place, procedurally, before any new value became something he could later claim I'd built using marital resources or marital time. An argument his attorney would absolutely try to make if given the opportunity. Every day I waited was a day that strengthened the wall around what I'd built. So I kept making coffee at 6:15. I kept asking about his fictional client dinners. I sat across from him at that same kitchen table, watching him eat chicken and rice, watching him check his phone under the table when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and I said nothing, because for the first time in 11 years, I finally understood exactly how much power silence could hold when you used it on purpose. Patricia filed the initial paperwork on a Monday in February, timed deliberately for a week when Grant had a business trip that would keep him 3 states away when he was served, which she explained was standard practice, not cruelty, simply the cleanest way to ensure he couldn't attempt to move funds or documents before the freeze took effect. I remember that Monday morning with unusual clarity. I made his coffee. I said goodbye at the door like always. I watched his car pull out of the driveway, and I stood in the kitchen for a long moment afterward. Not triumphant exactly, just quiet, the way a house feels quiet after a storm has finally broken. Instead of continuing to build, I drove to work. I sat through meetings. At 2:47 that afternoon, Patricia texted me one word: served. I didn't respond right away. I just sat with it. He called that evening from his hotel, and I let it go to voicemail twice before answering the third time. because I needed a moment to arrange my voice into something steady. He was angrier than I expected, which told me something about how little he'd prepared for the possibility of consequences. He wanted to know what this was about, said the word ambush more than once, said he didn't understand where any of this was coming from. I told him, calmly, that Patricia would be handling all further communication and that if he had questions about the specifics, his own attorney would receive full documentation shortly. He asked, and I remember this part precisely, whether I was doing this because of money. I said, "No, Grant. I'm doing this because you forged my signature on a loan to fund an affair with someone from your office," and I ended the call. The next several weeks unfolded the way divorces unfold once the paperwork exists, slower than television makes it look, full of scheduling calls and document requests, and the particular exhaustion of dividing a life into exhibits. Grant moved out within the month, into an apartment close to his office, and Renata's sources, the same instinct for information she'd always had, confirmed what I already suspected, that Danielle had been the one urging him to find his own place rather than wait out the process at home. He tried, once, in a lawyer's conference room during a settlement conference, to raise the subject of Voss Precision, calling it a marital asset since it had, in his words, existed and grown throughout our marriage. Patricia didn't even look up from her notes. Incorporated under a separate name, capitalized from separately held and documented funds, she said, "There's nothing here to argue." His attorney pushed once more, the following week, requesting a fuller accounting of Voss Precision's financials, clearly hoping to find some thread of commingling to pull on. Patricia provided everything, cheerfully, because she'd built the file specifically to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny, every dollar traced to consulting income earned and banked before the incorporation, every equity stake documented with dates that predated any argument he could construct. There was nothing to find because I had spent 2 years, quietly and on purpose, making sure there would be nothing to find. Grant's attorney stopped raising it after that meeting. I don't know exactly what conversation happened between the two of them afterward, but I imagine it was some version of the conversation where a lawyer tells a client that a fight isn't worth the fee it will cost to lose it. What Grant didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that his own professional life was about to collide with mine in a way none of us could have planned. His firm, a regional wealth management company, had spent the better part of a year courting a new institutional client, a healthcare-focused private equity group looking to consolidate several of their portfolio companies under one financial advisory relationship. It was, by every account I later heard, the deal that was supposed to make Grant's career, the one that would finally push him toward the partnership track he'd been chasing for years. The private equity group's due diligence team, as part of evaluating the portfolio companies, needed to verify supplier relationships for one of their holdings, an orthopedic device manufacturer in Ohio, the same one. The one whose 3-year exclusive contract now sat with Voss Precision. I found out about the connection almost by accident, the way most of this story seems to have unfolded, through Denise, who mentioned in an otherwise routine operations call that the device manufacturer's ownership group was doing some kind of financial review and had requested a call to confirm our contract terms directly with their advisory team. She read me the name of the advisory firm handling the review. I recognized it immediately, because it was Grant's firm, and because the deal lead listed on the request, the person whose signature was on the outreach email, was Grant himself. I sat with that information for a long moment. The particular kind of quiet that comes when the universe hands you something you couldn't have engineered if you'd tried. I told Denise to schedule the call. I told her I'd be joining it myself. The call happened on a Wednesday morning. 3 parties on the line. Denise, myself under my full legal name, which by then, mid-divorce, was still technically Marisa Ellison, though everyone at Voss knew me as Voss, and Grant's associate walking through standard supplier verification questions. Grant himself joined 7 minutes in, apologizing for running late from another call, and I watched his name populate on the screen share before he'd even said a word. There was a pause after Denise introduced the Voss precision side of the call, a pause just slightly too long, and then Grant's voice, careful in a way I recognized instantly, asked whether he had the wrong meeting link, because he said he wasn't aware Voss Precision was affiliated with anyone he knew. I unmuted myself and said, "Hello, Grant," and let the silence that followed do whatever work it needed to do. I want to tell you honestly that I hadn't planned this exact moment, hadn't scripted it, hadn't imagined the specific mechanics of how it would land, but I had absolutely built the conditions that made it possible. 2 years of quiet, careful construction that meant when this collision finally happened, I was standing on solid ground, and he was standing on none. He recovered his professional composure within about 30 seconds, because he was, whatever else he was, competent at his job, and the call continued, technical, correct, entirely businesslike. But I heard something underneath his voice for the rest of that call that I recognized immediately because I'd spent 11 years learning to read it. He was afraid. The deal did not fall apart because of me. I want to be precise about that because I know how satisfying the alternate version might sound, and I don't want to claim credit for something I didn't do. I never once suggested to Denise, or to anyone at Voss Precision, that our contract terms should shift because of who was asking. We verified the same numbers we would have verified for anyone. What happened instead was simpler and, in its own way, more damning. Grant's firm's compliance department, doing routine review before the deal's final approval, flagged that the lead advisor on a healthcare consolidation deal had an undisclosed personal conflict, a soon-to-be ex-wife who owned the exclusive supplier for one of the portfolio companies under review. It wasn't fraud. It was worse for him in a quieter way. It was a disclosure failure on the deal of his career. Renata heard the rest through channels I never asked too many questions about, and I'll tell you what she told me because I think it matters to how this story ends. Grant was pulled from the deal within a week, replaced by a colleague, and while the firm didn't fire him outright, he was moved off the partnership track he'd spent 6 years building toward, quietly, the way these things happen in industries built on appearances, a reassignment that everyone understood without anyone saying the actual words. Around the same time, according to the same channels, Danielle stopped coming into the office as often. I don't know the exact shape of what happened between them once his trajectory changed, and I made a deliberate choice not to ask, because by then, I had stopped needing to know. I had somewhere else to put my attention. The divorce finalized on a Thursday in late June, 7 months after Patricia filed that first document. The house went to me. The forged equity line became a matter Grant's attorney very quietly advised him to resolve before it became a separate legal problem entirely, and Voss Precision, exactly as Patricia had structured it from the beginning, remained entirely and unambiguously mine. I signed the final paperwork in Patricia's office, the same neat handwriting on her notes as the day I'd first walked in, and when it was done, she closed the folder and said, almost gently, "You did the hard part before you ever walked in here." I hadn't thought of it that way until she said it, but she was right. The paperwork had simply caught up to a decision I'd already made 2 years earlier, standing in my father's old office, deciding not to sell. I moved through the following months the way you move through anything after a long period of holding your breath. Slowly at first, then with a kind of momentum that surprised me. Voss Precision signed its second major contract that fall, a smaller supplier agreement but one that opened a relationship with a company that would matter enormously the following year. I promoted Priya to head of engineering, gave Denise the formal title she'd earned 19 years earlier and never received, and hired 6 new people in Dayton, people with families and mortgages, and the kind of stake in a company's survival that Grant had once dismissed as not worth the hassle. I drove out most Fridays still, though I no longer needed to hide it from anyone, and there was a specific pleasure in that, walking through the plant floor in full daylight, no longer a secret, just mine. I ran into Grant exactly once after the divorce finalized, at a shared friend's 40th birthday gathering neither of us had realized the other would attend. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, just diminished in some way I couldn't fully name, the particular deflation of a man whose story about himself had stopped matching his actual life. He asked how the business was going, careful, almost formal, and I told him, briefly, that it was going well. He nodded and said he'd heard some things through mutual contacts, and there was a version of that sentence that could have carried resentment, but instead it just sounded tired. He said he was sorry, not elaborately, not performed the way I might have expected from him a year earlier, just quiet and plain. I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. I didn't stay long after. I think about my father sometimes, standing in that office that still smelled like machine oil, and I think about the version of myself who almost sold everything he built because someone I trusted told me it wasn't worth the hassle. I think about how close I came to believing him, not because I lacked confidence exactly, but because 11 years of being quietly underestimated has a way of making you doubt your own read on your own capabilities. What I've learned since, the thing I actually want you to take from this if nothing else, is that the people who dismiss what you're building are very rarely the people who understand what you're capable of. They're usually just the people who've stopped paying attention. And the day you stop needing their attention to know your own worth is the day everything actually starts to change. Voss Precision closed this past spring on a facility expansion that will double our production capacity by next year, funded entirely through retained earnings. No outside investors, no debt beyond what the business itself can comfortably carry. Denise runs day-to-day operations now with an authority she's earned 100 times over. Priya has 3 patents pending from work she started in that same building where I once sat with my father's ledgers spread across his old desk, trying to decide if any of this was worth trying to save. I know now it was always worth it. Not because of what it became financially, though I won't pretend that part doesn't matter, but because of what it taught me about the distance between what someone tells you you're capable of and what you actually are. I still make coffee most mornings, though the ritual means something different now. I stand in my kitchen, the one that's fully mine, the tile still cold under my feet, and I watch the light change over a backyard nobody else gets to have an opinion about. I think about the woman who used to stand in that same spot, 20 minutes of quiet before a day that mostly belonged to someone else's expectations, and I don't feel sorry for her exactly. I understand her. She was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time, and what she didn't know yet was that she was already building the thing that would eventually set her free. If you're standing in your own version of that kitchen right now, quietly building something nobody's asked you about yet, I hope you keep going. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We'd love to hear from you.